Our topic is the Eighth Amendment, focusing on mental illness and the death penalty. The Eighth Amendment demonstrates what is to be an American because it protects us from cruel and unusual punishments. Therefore, people who are mentally challenged should not be given the death penalty. Although some Americans may feel that the Eighth Amendment is the correct way to punish people who are mentally challenged. Any of various conditions characterize impairment of individuals' normal emotion or behavioral functioning and caused by social, psychological, biochemical, genetic, or other factors such as infection or health. This is an issue in today's world because not many people are concerned that people who are disabled are innocent and are being executed.
A case called Penry versus Linaw, at which time they said on an individualized basis, juries must consider mental retardation as a mitigating factor. But now the question is whether in all circumstances the evolving standards of decency have developed to such a point that it is cruel and unusual punishment.
Sure. That involves Bobby James Moore, who was sentenced to death in 1980 for killing a store employee during a robbery. His lawyers say his death sentence should be tossed out because Texas courts used an outdated and unscientific standard to assess whether his intellectual disability was so severe that it would be cruel and unusual to execute him. Basically, they're saying the legal definition of intellectually disabled should match the most recent clinical definitions used by professional medical associations, like those promulgated by the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. According to Moore's lawyers, he scored in the high 50s to mid-70s on IQ tests throughout the years, and he's well within the range of mental retardation as recognized by the American Association on Mental Retardation.
Okay.
In my testimony today, I'll describe traditional responses and the problem at hand while suggesting steps this committee can take to help us. So many police encounters involve people who essentially are displaying symptoms of untreated mental illness. And let me be clear at this point, and from the start, that any person who commits serious crime should be arrested, prosecuted, and appropriately sentenced, including the mentally ill. But as I will illustrate, when it comes to the police response to people with mental illnesses who commit less serious crimes, we can serve them and our communities better by a collaborative police mental health approach. Many police encounters involve persons acting in a disorderly or disturbing manner, and the examples are plentiful. It could be the person urinating on a street corner or directing traffic in the middle of Main Street. In other cases, a family member calls because their loved one with a history of mental illness needs immediate help and they don't know where to turn. They may be frightened for their own safety, or they can no longer take the stress. In these scenarios, we all agree that treatment is needed. Often the police are the only resources available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we simply do not possess the diagnostic expertise of mental health professionals. In many rural areas, we may be the only resource available within a 45-minute or more drive. In communities without effective partnerships, the police have three options. First is to do nothing, and while we must accept the fact that in some realities with severely inadequate treatment services, that this approach continues to be a reality. The second is to link the person with appropriate mental health services, but unfortunately, as in the first, in many communities, such services are simply inaccessible. The third and by far most common option is to arrest if a minor crime has been committed. When arrested, minor offenders with mental illnesses land in a criminal justice system ill-equipped to meet their needs, where they often deteriorate further. They then re-enter the community far worse, and the cycle repeats. Only the relatively rare police call involves a person with mental illness, exhibiting threatening behavior and brandishing a weapon. These tragic incidents perpetuate the myth that people with mental illnesses are more violent than the general population, and this is what becomes our front page news. I'm going to read.
Well, in the past, the Supreme Court has ruled that the death penalty is an unconstitutional punishment for specific groups of people. Those people include juveniles, people convicted of crimes other than murder, and the mentally insane, as well as the disabled. Well, this week, the highest court began hearing oral arguments in a case that aims to better define who actually fits into that one category of mentally disabled. RT's Anya Parampil is at the Supreme Court for us.
This morning, the Supreme Court heard the oral arguments in the case of Brumfield v. Kane, a case that legal experts agree will clarify existing restrictions on the death penalty. Now, the case of Brumfield v. Kane seeks to determine whether or not the Eighth Amendment, which is supposed to guarantee that no American is subject to cruel and unusual punishment, would require a hearing separate from the conviction and sentencing hearings to be held in order to determine whether or not an individual is mentally disabled. The case concerned the trial of Kevin Brumfield of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who is facing the death penalty for the 1993 killing of a security guard. Now, initially during Brumfield's sentencing, his defense did not argue that their client was mentally disabled, but did include testimony from a psychologist and social worker who simply questioned Brumfield's mental state, considering what they determined was an abused childhood. It was only after Brumfield was sentenced to death and after the 2002 Supreme Court ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, which barred capital punishment for the mentally deficient, that a defense lawyer unsuccessfully attempted to argue that Brumfield should be taken off death row. Throughout the appeal process, the Fifth Circuit Court also withheld funds from Brumfield's lawyers, which they needed to fund an investigation into his mental state. And the briefs on the merits of the case have asserted that the court was wrong in doing that. Now, his lawyers find themselves making the argument to the justices here that an entirely new hearing is necessary to sufficiently determine the mental capacity of their client. And a decision could not only certainly save his life, but also complicate cases concerning the death penalty in the future. From the Supreme Court, this is Anya Parampil, RT.
Hi, my name is Kathy O'Brien, and I'm a social worker with the Senior Options Program with the Area Agency on Aging in Columbus, Ohio. I've been a social worker for about 25 years and have worked with the severely mentally disabled for most of that time. So do I think the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment, especially when it's applied to the mentally ill? And yes, I do, until our justice system is able to determine without a doubt that the individual was competent and aware of the wrongness of their actions at the time of the crime. I do believe, especially in that case, that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment. Do you think stigma and fear play a part in jury verdicts when the defendant is mentally ill? And yes, I believe it does. There's so much stigma with those surrounding those with severe mental disabilities, and there's a prevailing thought that people with mental disabilities are more likely to commit violent crimes, which is not the case. Until our society as a whole is more aware and informed of mental illness, I believe that the bias will always be a risk in an unfair verdict. One study estimates that 205 people on death row have a serious mental illness. Do you think that number is large enough that we should stop using the death penalty? And yes, I do. I believe that anyone who is sentenced to death, one person being put to death unfairly, is one too many, and especially I think it's a huge problem with the mentally ill, not being able to advocate for themselves or secure representation. So yes, I do think a moratorium on the death penalty should be in place until we address these issues as a society. In some cases, a mentally ill defendant is not given the death penalty, but they can still be executed later if they recover from their mental illness. Do you think this should happen? No, I don't. I think that if the person's judgment was compromised at the time of the crime because of their mental illness, they should be judged solely on that and not on when they recover and if they regain competency. Do you believe as Americans we have the responsibility to provide better mental health care to our citizens? Absolutely. I think that it's gotten better as the stigma has, as education has happened and the stigma has gotten better, but I still believe that people with mental illnesses fall through the cracks and don't receive the treatment they need due to lack of insurance coverage, accessibility to care, and the inability to advocate for themselves, and the stigma surrounding mental illness. Thank you.
With a lot of that too. Okay.
Sorry. Based on your background with policing, is punishing someone with a mental illness against the Eighth Amendment?
I believe so. Yeah.
What procedure do you think should be taken if a person with a mental illness commits a crime harsh enough to receive the death penalty?
Intensive therapy and rehabilitation, medical attention, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there other measures that can be taken besides the death penalty?
Yeah, absolutely. Institutionalization, and again, I mean, a lot of people with mental illness, when they're properly cared for, usually it's medication, they don't have issues, but it's just keeping them on that road and keeping them safe, and that's a problem because a lot of people with mental illness go off of their medications, and that's what leads them to commit a lot of crime.
Thank you.
Okay. Based on your background, do you believe punishing someone with a mental illness goes against the Eighth Amendment?
I think that's a really complicated question. What I'm going to address with the mental health system in general is that we are really underserved, and there's a lot of people out there that we probably could have helped before they got into a situation where they're breaking the law or committing a crime. So of course, sorry. My phone went off. I'm sorry. I think that it is an unfair system. We have a lot of times that people don't have their first access to mental health until they get into the criminal justice system. So I think that that's not really giving somebody a fair shot.
All right. Why do you think people don't take mental illness seriously?
I think there's a lot of stigma when it comes to mental health concerns. People are not really always well educated about them, or just they don't get the information that's correct. And one of the biggest myths out there is people with mental illnesses are more violent than people without mental illnesses. And actually, the actual fact around that is that a person with a mental illness is more likely to be a victim of a crime than they are to cause a crime. So I think that just because sometimes when we do see things on the media about people with mental illnesses, committing crimes, that we, as a society, draw conclusions that mental illness equals more people more prone to violence, and that's actually, there's a lot of people living with mental illness that are not violent. So it's just very misunderstood, and we need to do a better job as a society educating people.
Do you think avoiding or not taking someone's mental illness seriously is wrong?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we have to see mental illnesses just like every other illness. I think that historically, if someone has a physical illness, cancer, broken arm, we will treat that illness, right? And a lot of times, because the stigma and other just preconceptions about mental illness that are not true, it discourages people from getting the help that they need. And so if we're avoiding it or not taking it seriously, then people are not getting the help that they need and the treatment that's out there. That's the one thing that I always tell people as a counselor, that people do get better. Treatment does work. It's just, but we need to get more people access to that treatment.
Do you believe that people who are mentally challenged deserve the death penalty?
So I think this one is a really difficult question to answer, because I do understand that, when a very serious crime is committed, that the family or the people involved with that crime do want justice served for the thing that had occurred, and I get where people are coming from with that. That being said, I also think that if we're not being proactive and really looking at the full picture and looking at someone's mental health history or their lack of access to services or treatment, that we're not looking at the full picture. So I don't think it's a fair system if we're not looking at the whole picture.